May it please the court, Mr. Grimke, Stansky. My name again is Steve Hurley, and along with Jonas Bednarik, whom you met yesterday, and Siobhan Cagle, we represent Todd Kendhammer. Within a couple of days, you'll figure out that Siobhan, our paralegal, is actually the boss. In his opening statement, Mr. Grimke told you that you're not going to hear evidence of a motive to kill Barbara Kendhammer. It's not simply that you're not going to hear such evidence. What you will hear is evidence of one of those quiet but amazing love stories. Todd Kendhammer was about 14 years old when he met Barbara Kendhammer, who was a freshman in high school. And he had gone to a cousin's wedding. And there he saw her. And he'll tell you that the moment he saw her, he knew she was the one. They talked. He found out that she shared a lot of his interests. His interests were simple. Going for walks, talking, camping, fishing. She didn't share his interest in hunting. But other than that, he thought he had met his soulmate. And the problem for him was that at that time, she had a boyfriend. And for the next 4 years, he waited in what my children call the friend zone. He took every opportunity that he could find to be with her, to be around her. When she wasn't with her boyfriend, he was there. They talked a lot. They became really good friends. He even went on outings with her and her family. Didn't especially like her boyfriend. He knew that when her boyfriend dropped her off at home at 10 p.m., because her parents were very strict about that, her boyfriend would go out and find other girls to be with. I never said a word about it. He was just always there at her side. And when they graduated high school, she finally figured it out. And she no longer saw that boyfriend. She and Todd developed an even stronger friendship. And after a while, began to date. And after a couple of years, she and Todd got married. In time, they had children. Go too far. On the left, you see their son, Jordan. With Jordan is his girlfriend, also named Jordan. So in the trial, you'll hear about boy Jordan and girl Jordan, which is how everyone distinguished them. On the right, you'll see their daughter, Jessica. And that's her husband, Michael Service, and their child. Here are Barb and Todd at Jessica and Michael's wedding. A month before Barb's death, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary. They had planned only to go out and have dinner together. And their children and a lot of their close relatives surprised them. And they hired a limo. And they had a huge party. And then they wound up going on their 25th anniversary trip together. And this is a picture of Todd and Barb with their grandchild, Carlin. They had a kind of marriage where they were constantly in touch with one another. Her mom lived nearby, and almost every day, Barb would call her mom. Not, as the prosecution said, every day, almost every day. When she didn't call, Todd often called. You'll hear that in the 6 months prior to the occurrence on September 15 and 16, that Todd had called his mother-in-law about 300 times. And all of that pales in comparison to the number of times they called and texted one another during the day. They're in constant touch with one another. They had a morning routine. She worked at the local school as a cook. He worked at Crown Manufacturing. They would get up in the morning. They would have breakfast. Oftentimes he would drive her to work. Sometimes she would drive herself. In the evenings, they would come home after having called and texted one another during the day. They'd sit on the front porch and talk about their day. Sometimes they'd go for a drive. They like to go for drives through the country. They just drive and talk to each other. Sometimes they drive and stop for ice cream. Sometimes they drive to places they've been many times before, and sometimes they drive to places they've never been. They worked hard together. If he was mowing the lawn, she'd come out and mow too. If he was shoveling snow, she'd come out and shovel snow too. For extra money, and they had no financial difficulties, for extra money, they learned that they were very good at purchasing houses and refurbishing them and reselling them, what people often call flipping a house. And they did that many times, and they worked on them together. He was especially good at doing the heavy work, and she was especially good at making the decisions about decor and where things ought to be. Todd will tell you that the only times that he was never with her was when he went hunting camp. In the 25 years they were married, the only times he was never with her was when they went to hunting camp. And he stayed overnight. But even on those nights, when the others were having dinner at hunting camp, he would leave and drive home to have dinner with Barb, make sure that she had everything she needed, and then he'd go back and sleep and endure endless ribbing about the fact that he couldn't even have dinner with the boys. If she forgot her Bubba cup, he would take it to her. Now, you've heard reference to this cup. It was found in the front passenger compartment of the car after the accident. Barb didn't like the water at school. So every day, she'd take this big cup, and the trade name for it is a Bubba cup, and it's got that big around it. And she'd fill it with water, and she'd take it with her to school, and that was all she drank when she was at the school. Sometimes she'd call and say, I forgot to bring it. He'd stop what he was doing, he'd go back home, he'd get it, and he'd drive it to her. Their relationship was so intimate and so confident that they never said to one another, I love you. What they said to one another was, I love you too. The other person, and know that that other person was saying with their eyes, I love you. So they'd only say, I love you too. On that Friday that the accident occurred, they'd been planning to go to Cranfest the following week, Cranfest in New Orleans. And this is something that they did with family and a couple of friends every single year. Barb really liked to go there and she was fond of crafts. And they had a lot of crafts at Cranfest. She really liked to go there and buy her Christmas gifts. Sometimes she'd kind of spy and say, I really like that, but I think you and I can make this. Otherwise, she'd buy it. And they always wanted to make sure that they had a place for their trailer at Cranfest. So what they arranged to do with their friends and family was to go up on the preceding we can and claim a space for their trailer. They take the trailer up, camper, find a place they were going to be, and leave it there for the entire week. And so that's what they were planning on doing that Friday evening on the day of the accident. They got up that morning, and it was, for them, a pretty normal morning. The only thing that was different was that they were also packing that morning. The prior day, did that wrong. Prior evening, you will hear that Todd texted his son-in-law, Michael Service. Now, Michael was remodeling the house, and Todd was helping him remodel the house. And Todd was supposed to put up some sheetrock on Thursday evening. You'll see at 6:34 p.m., Todd texts Michael and says, "Can I do it in the morning?" And Michael texts back and says, "I'll do it tonight if you can't get there. It's no big deal." That was at 6:40 p.m. Todd, having received that text, went over and put in the sheetrock. You see at 8:30, an incoming text from Michael Service. "Thanks for stopping over. I put the other piece on by the back door real quick." The next morning, they got up early, and you'll see that Michael texted Todd, "I'll try to get to your work to pick up the Tahoe today because we needed to get the carpet and flooring on the weekend." See, Todd, shortly later, about 12, 14 minutes later, says, "I don't work today. I'll dump it. Did you go pay for the flooring?" Then an incoming message, "I'll call you soon." Now, the other thing that was going on that morning was that Barb's mom, who lived nearby, was having trouble with the water service at her house. And so the plumber was coming, and Todd had arranged for that. And Todd called the plumber that morning. And he also called Joyce Adams, Barb's mom, to remind her about the plumbing. Then he called his voicemail at 7:28:13 and again at 7:28:50. Barb normally was at work at 8 o'clock, and she was, by all accounts, a punctual person. She was, however, late on occasion. That morning, they set out to look for something before work. About 2 months before all of this occurred, Todd had talked to some people at work about whether they knew of anybody who needed a windshield replaced on a Ford, and a specific model Ford. Now, Todd, you must understand, spent a good deal of his early years working in glass. During high school, he worked for an outfit here in La Crosse called A1 Glass. And he worked there for many, many years. He learned the business. He learned how to install glass. Later, when he left A1 Glass, he and a friend started their own business together. And Todd picked up money on the side occasionally by installing glass windshields. And he had a windshield that someone had ordered and then canceled the order. And it had been sitting in the garage for quite a long time. Barb and Todd, you'll hear, never argued. What they called an argument, you and I would raise our eyebrows at. At best, one could say that one corrected the other on occasion. Barb said, you shouldn't leave your shoes by the front door. I would say, okay. And they would call that an argument, and nobody else in the world would. And just before they were leaving for Cranfest that weekend, Barb said, I want that windshield out of my garage. Now, 2 months before, Todd had this conversation in the lunchroom at Crown with people. And Justin Hine was there, and I think one of the three Logan brothers was present. And people talked about this, and Justin Hine said he knew somebody that needed a windshield like that. Somebody else said that they thought Terry Logan needed a windshield like that. Terry Logan here lives just on Highway M, just north of where the accident occurred. So on that morning, Todd was going to go out and look for Terry Logan's place. He wasn't quite sure where it was. And hopefully find the truck there that needed it and take the truck back to install the windshield and get it out of Barb's garage. It was while looking for that the accident occurred.
Mr. Hurley, before you go on, I'm having a little hard time hearing you. You need to use the microphone, so stay positioned there.
I will, Judge. I apologize.
Nope, that's fine. Thank you.
This is a map of the area much like the ones that Mr. Grunke showed to you. You see it up in the upper right-hand corner. It says Residences on Scotch Cooley Road. Now, right next to the Kendhammer house, just a little ways down, was the residence of Barbara Thompson. And both Barb and Todd took care of that residence when Barb was gone, and she was gone at this time. And in addition to that, they'd been negotiating with Barbara Thompson about purchasing her place. Ms. Thompson had a shed there in which the Kendhammers kept a lot of equipment. And from time to time, because that shed was unlocked, they would stop on the way to work to check to see that the equipment wasn't there, that nobody had taken it or tampered with it. And that's what they did that morning. So they took a couple minutes diversion from going on their route to just stop there and check on the equipment. And then they traveled the route that you see in red on the map. And it was, let me put this up to show you the route in relation to West Salem Middle School where Barb worked. So up here, where you see this circle, that's where the residences are of the Kendhammers and Barbara Thompson. And what you see in blue from that circle down to here, over to here, and up to here is the route that they took that morning. It was Todd's intention to go further up County Trunk M, just a little ways where he thought Terry Logan lived, and hopefully find that automobile. Then he was going to take Barb to work at West Salem Middle School. And it was at Burgham Cooley Road where he traveled to this morning that the accident occurred. That day, it was raining and overcast, and unlike today, that day they weren't on daylight saving time. It was a different hour of the day than you saw you seen that. It's a different time of year. There's a lot of vegetation at that time. When you went today, you saw along the road that the berm had been cut, that the crops were out of the field. You saw from the drone photograph that Mr. Grimke showed you that at the time of this occurrence, the berm was high, the crops were still in the field, the trees had plenty of foliage, so the sight lines were different as well. That day, however, was rainy and overcast. And Todd was driving, he was belted in, or he was not belted in, Barb was belted in. And he had the lights on his automobile. As he was headed down Highway M, he saw an object. And he saw an object coming toward the car, an object that he subsequently determined was a pipe, because that object eventually came through the windshield of the automobile. When he saw the object coming, he rose out of his seat and he struck his fist into the windshield from the inside in order to prevent the pipe from striking. He was unsuccessful in stopping the pipe, and it came through and it struck Barbara Kendhammer. He traveled down the road to the intersection. He turned on the intersection. At some point, he meant to put the car in park. He was so shaken, he put it into reverse, and it backed down into the berm, as you saw in some of the other photographs. What he saw was his wife flailing about violently. Arms, legs, shoulders, flailing about. He got out of the automobile, which was difficult because it was backed into the ditch. And he came around to the passenger side. And he opened the door to the passenger side, and the door kept closing on him. And he knew that he had to get her out of the automobile. He saw her flailing around, and he pulled the pipe out. And you'll hear that when he pulled the pipe out from the passenger side, with the door open behind him, as he pulled it out, the windshield became a fulcrum and caused another crack in the windshield. And when he pulled it out, he threw it into the grass, and you've seen a photograph of that pipe in the grass. And then he tried to get her out of the automobile, and it was extraordinarily difficult. He knew that she was stuck on something. He wrapped his arms around her and tried to pull her out, and he caught on something, and he yanked, and they tumbled backwards into the berm with her on top of him, which is how her head came to be next to the wheel. And he began, because he saw that she didn't seem to be breathing, he began to give her CPR. Now, you're going to hear from experts in this case that when she was struck in the head by the pipe, it was a critical blow, causing brain damage. And that additionally, she experienced, in the dynamic situation that was occurring in the car, she experienced what's called, in layman's terms, the beginning of a cutoff of the air passage. And when they fell out of the car, he saw that she wasn't breathing and began to give her chest compressions. And then he thought, I have to call 911. And he was so overwrought that the first thing he did was call 191. And when the call didn't go through, he called 911. And you will hear those calls in just a moment. What you will hear in those calls is genuine distress. And you will also hear a moment in the calls when Mr. Kendhammer realizes that he has to reposition her because her head is facing downhill. And he has to get her head up the incline. And you will hear him say to the 911 operator, I'm going to try to do something with her. I'm going to put the phone down. And that's when he repositions her body so that her head is uphill. Here is the first 911 call.
Friday, September 16, 2016, 0805 and 25 seconds.
911, what is the address of the place? I'm on Bosom Cool. You got it, what's the address? Going to the beginning of Bosom Cool. Okay, take a deep breath because I'm having a hard time understanding you. Bosom Cool Road in West Elm. Okay, and what happened there? A pipe went through and got us. What blew? A pipe went through the windshield. Okay, is there an address there? No, I'm right at the beginning. I turned off and got in the ditch. Okay, so Bergen Cooley Road, and you turned off for what road? Scotch Cooley. Scotch Cooley. And now, is somebody hurt? Yes, bad. Okay. Hurry up, I don't want to see you on it. No, but Scotch Cooley and Bergen Cooley or County Evans? Bergen Cooley. And County Evans go out for Bergen Cooley, right at the beginning. Okay, but right at the beginning. Hold on, let me just see if I can figure out where you are from my... Hello? County Evans, Bergen Cooley, okay.
There you hear the call terminate. Why it terminates, no one can be certain of, probably because reception in that area was not good. And so there is a callback, a second call with 911.
Medical dispatch, Jared.
Hi, Jared. This is Lisa over at 911.
Yeah.
Were you guys recontacting on that PI accident on Bergen Cooley? Or do you want me to try to?
I don't think so. Were you guys going to call that Bergen Cooley number? Not at this moment, no.
Okay, I'll try recounting. I didn't want to do it if you guys were trying to get through. All right.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
You called me. I've got any help now? Yes. Hang on. I've got police and ambulance, first responders headed to Emmons and Cooley. I need you to tell me what happened. Slow down. Did the car work? Needs help. Okay. And so your wife is injured? Yes. Okay, and there was in a car accident?
Yes, a pipe or something came through the windshield. A pipe did.
Pipe? Okay. All right. And I'm going to connect you to medical information, sir. What's your first name?
Todd.
Todd, okay. And they're going to help you help her until somebody gets there, okay?
Yeah.
And then you're going to hear a dial tone in the phone ring. Just stay on the phone. Let me talk first when they pick up, okay? Mm-hmm.
Communication.
Hi, this is Lisa, 911. I've got Todd on the line reference that accident at Bergen County in County M. He said a pipe or something came through the windshield and hit his wife. His callback number is the number on the header, 608-790-2360. So he needs some help with it. Go ahead.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened. He got her and she's hitting her head in the throat, I think, in the throat or something. She's got blood coming out of her nose and mouth and it's really big and blue.
How old is she?
46.
Is she awake?
No, until we get her done right, she talked at first a little bit.
Okay. Is she breathing?
No, I don't think so. No.
All right, sir. We do have help on the way. Stay on the line.
How long?
You're
Off the road.
Sir, I want you to stay. I want you to stay right where you're at, sir.
Okay. I'm going to try to do something with it.
Yep, we're going
I'm going to put the phone down.
can you get her out of the vehicle, sir?
I got her out.
Okay, I want you to lay her flat on the ground.
I got her flat. I'm not going to stay, but I don't know what to do with this.
Okay, listen carefully. I'm going to tell you how to do chest compressions. Place the heel of your hand on her breastbone, right between her nipples.
I know how to do that.
The other hand is the top.
I know how to do that.
Pump the chest hard and fast.
He's got blood coming out of his mouth.
That's okay. Go ahead and pump it twice per second and 2 inches deep, okay?
Okay.
Let the chest come up all the way between the pumps.
I'll come back in a minute.
Okay, keep going, sir.
She got blood bubbling out of her mouth, Dad.
That's okay. That's okay. We're going to keep pumping the chest hard and fast, okay?
Pass out.
I'm very doing great, sir. You're doing just fine. Keep pumping the chest hard and fast, 2 inches deep. Keep going, sir. You're doing great.
How far out are they?
They're coming as fast as they can, sir.
I know, but how fast is that?
They're coming.
I know, but I can't stay there much longer like this.
Yes, you can. You're doing a great job. You're doing what you can right now for her.
She's breathing out her ear, too.
Okay.
I hit her hard when she whipped around.
Okay. That's okay. We're not hurting her at all right now.
Here comes somebody that's starting to get over here.
Okay. Just keep going. Okay, keep going, sir.
I am. They're coming. They're coming. They're coming.
You're doing great, sir. Keep going.
Okay, I gotta hang out. There they come. There they come.
Stay on the phone until you get right next to her. Okay, keep doing CPR. You're doing great, sir.
Good. Come on, Bart.
You're doing great. You just keep on going until they get right up next to her, and they'll take over.
I'm on the other side of the car. I have to show them where I am. I have to show them.
They'll find you, sir. You're doing great.
Okay, they're here. I can't.
Okay, make sure they come right up next to her.
I got them. I can't. I gotta get them.
Okay. We want to continue with the CPR for her.
They can't find me. They're past me. Okay. Come on, Bergen Cooley, that's him. Come on. Fuck me. Oh my God, come on. Oh my God. Okay, so we got him turned around. Keep going. Keep going. Get him back here. Get him back here. Get him back here. Come on. Yep, they're coming. I don't see him.
Which side of Bergen Cooley are you on, Todd?
There's only one Bergen Cooley.
No, which side of the road?
You don't see my car. Try to turn around. Holy fuck. Are you hurrying? They're coming, Todd. Keep on going.
What you'll hear, or what you heard, when Todd was saying, I'm on Bergen Cooley, tell him to turn around, is his panicking when the first responders went past Bergen Cooley Road and you could see that occurring. He was telling him to bring it back. When Mr. Grinke was making his opening remarks, he showed you photographs of the scene. And the photographs he showed you were photographs taken after the first responders had done their job and Barbara Kendhammer was eventually put into an ambulance and taken away. Now, when the first responder came, you'll hear that he asked Todd to help him move Barbara yet one more time, so that she was up on the road. And so they did that. This is a photograph of the automobile backed into the berm while the first responders are there, and to the left on the ground you can see a little bit of Barbara Kendhammer being tended to. This is later as they're tending to her. And in the background, you see Todd Kendhammer being restrained from going to Barbara. If I go back, here, if one did not point out to you that the windshield was cracked, it is unlikely that you would observe that. It's certainly from not if one was in a moving vehicle passing by. And you'll hear, by the way, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. You'll hear, by the way, a glass expert, not just any glass expert, but one of the foremost glass experts in the nation tell you that someone driving by, like Mr. Earler, about whom the state spoke to you this morning, was most unlikely to have ever noticed that anything was awry with the glass. Here, you see the windshield. And we're going to hear a lot about this windshield during this trial. You're going to hear, for example, once again, you can see in the background Todd Kendhammer not being near this, being held back. This is a photograph of the puncture through the windshield. And you can see blood on where the puncture is. And you're going to hear from an expert that when the pipe was removed, blood was transferred onto the windshield. In the background of the puncture, you see a bulge in the windshield. And that is where Todd Kendhammer, you'll hear, struck the windshield from the inside with his left fist. Here, you'll see little bits and pieces of glass on the outside of the windshield at the scene that occurred when the pipe was pulled out of the windshield. It brought some of the glass to the outside. What you're seeing here is the bulge from having struck the glass from the inside. And this, all will agree, was the first impact to the glass. Here you see the windshield later. And this is at the State Crime Lab. And you'll note that you really can't see the blood any longer on puncture. Why that is, I'm not sure we'll ever know for sure, but it was raining that day, and the windshield was not covered during the entire time that first responders and police were there. The same is true of the pipe. Though the pipe was subsequently covered, the pipe was out in the rain and the wet grass. Here we see a closer view of what appear to you to be 2 points of impact. This is a closer view of the puncture with the flap extended. This is a photograph of Todd Kendhammer's hands. The prosecution showed you this photograph this morning, and I'm showing it to you now. You will hear from an expert how the puncture wound, or the puncture in the glass, not the puncture, but the indentation in the glass from that bubbled on the outside but did not puncture precisely fits a human fist. And you will hear that Todd Kendhammer's blood DNA are on the inside of that indentation. This is Todd Kendhammer's right hand. And you'll see that when he was at the hospital and it was cleaned, that there were not injuries to his right hand, as opposed to his left hand, and this is a view of his left hand at the hospital after his left hand had been cleaned. And this is the pipe in the wet grass at the scene where it was found. This is the pipe later on, dry at the sheriff's department. This is the inside of the front of the front driver's compartment of the car. And here you see right where the front driver's compartment comes up against the console, Barb's Bubba Cup. And as Mr. Grunke told you, there were 2 pieces broken off from that cup. And they will have significance, you will hear through expert witnesses, to the injuries that Barbara Kendhammer sustained during the accident. This is the same cup at the crime lab. What occurred was when Barbara was removed from the scene and the police were done with their business, the Kendhammer automobile was taken by the police. It was removed from the scene by a towing service, taken to the sheriff's department, and subsequently put into an over-the-road truck and driven 3 hours to the State Crime Lab in Madison. Not that day, but later on. During that time, all kinds of things got jostled within the automobile, so that when the crime lab examined the automobile, it was not in precisely the same condition that it was at the scene. And that mud that was here at the scene was now here when it was at the crime lab. This is a photograph of the top of the model with what appears to be a piece missing. We'll learn that it was actually broken into two pieces there. Sometime after the occurrence, we're talking almost 2 weeks, the police put out advertisements asking for information about what had occurred. In response, they received information that another pipe was in the road, or by the side of the road, up Highway M, further north from where the occurrence had happened, where the accident had happened, just right near where the quarry is. You will hear from many experts in this case. In his opening statement, Mr. Grunke told you about the state's experts. And he told you about Mr. Kendhammer's statements. When you hear evidence about Mr. Kendhammer's statements, you are also going to hear evidence that Mr. Kendhammer was never, ever questioned, except when he was in a terrible emotional state. The first 3 times he was questioned was right there at the scene. He was questioned first by an Officer Leffelholtz. Officer Leffelholtz spoke to him for 30 minutes. And during those 30 minutes, you'll hear that Todd Kendhammer asked 21 times, "Can I please go over to my wife? She's never alone. She needs me to be there. I need to be with her. Can I go over?" Subsequently, he was questioned by Officer Wickland 26 times in less than 20 minutes. He asked, "Can I see my wife? Can I be with her? Can I go with her to the hospital?" And they kept him away. Not necessarily for bad reasons at all. But all he was focused on was his wife. When he was being transported to the hospital, or in Officer Yaley's car, he asked 10 times in 27 minutes, "How is my wife? Can I be with my wife?" And it's during this time that the police are asking Todd Kendhammer about what happened. You will hear that Todd Kendhammer was just like you and me, that when he drove down a road, he paid attention to traffic. He needed, like you and I, to know what cars were coming down the road in his direction, what car was in the rearview mirror, what car might be in his side mirrors. But like you and me, you will hear he really wasn't paying attention to detail. Filing away in his head, what color was the car? What was the make and the model of the car? That doesn't matter. You'll hear that when he told the officers, "I can't recall exactly," he was told, "Well, close your eyes and see if you can visualize in your head what it was you saw." And it's then when he closes his eyes and begins to visualize that he begins to give statements about the car that just don't match with one another. You'll hear that what he initially said is, "I don't know for sure. I think it was a flatbed truck. That when he was pressed further, he said it was an older flatbed truck. And you will hear that he is continually pressed for information about what he said, I can't recall, only while he is in an emotional state. There came a time when the police asked to speak with him again. And it was the Thursday following the accident. You'll hear that after Barbara passed away, he was for days surrounded by family. He didn't sleep at home for the first 2 nights. He couldn't go back and sleep in the bed that he had shared with her. He stayed at his mother's place. He eventually went home and had family there. You'll hear that on the Thursday following her death, it finally hit him. It finally began to sink in. And he will tell you that this was the lowest point in his entire life. And she was to be buried the following day. He finally realized she was not coming back, that the love of his life was gone, that his life would never be the same again. And he told his family, I need to be alone. And so he went to his shop, which was away from the house. And there at the shop, he tried to engross himself in making a wooden heart to take to the funeral on which he was going to put memorabilia about Barbara. And he's going to tell you that he spent the day making that heart and crying, something which he's never been able to do in front of other people. And while he was doing that, he got a phone call from the police. And they lied to him. They said they wanted him to come down and talk to them because they had some video of possible flatbeds that they wanted him to look at. And he said, oh, okay. And he went straight there. And there he was questioned for several hours. And you're going to see that tape, and the state will present it to you. And for a long time in that tape, you're going to see someone who is in an emotional state and incredibly nervous. Todd has what they refer to as restless leg syndrome, something which you won't see here because he's taking medication. At what was the lowest point in his life, he was questioned over and over about the events preceding the pipe coming through the windshield. What was he doing? Where was he going? Things that were the last thing on his mind that day. You will hear in all of his interviews that Todd is inconsistent about what was going on immediately before the object came through the windshield, and absolutely consistent about what occurred after his wife got injured. Because it was after she got injured that it was important. And you'll hear that to him, nothing that he did before that moment was important. And you'll hear from an expert who talks to you about how we remember things and what our brain chooses to lock away to be remembered and what it chooses not to. And how it chooses to remember things that are important and not what we had for breakfast last week. You're going to hear from a Dr. Stephen Cook. And Dr. Stephen Cook is from nearby. And Dr. Cook has spent over 30 years as a trauma physician. 30 years in the emergency room, taking care of hundreds, if not thousands, of patients who were involved in automobile accidents. And he's going to tell you that when something like an object penetrating a windshield occurs, that it is not a linear occurrence, that there are dynamic forces involved, that when something comes through the windshield, it's not as though those on the inside are sitting perfectly still. And that the injuries that Barbara Kendhammer incurred are thoroughly consistent with someone who, in that dynamic situation, was moving at the time that the pipe struck her in the head. And that all of her injuries are consistent with what occurred within the cabin of that automobile and what occurred subsequently. Subsequently, you'll hear Barbara Kendhammer had to be yanked out of the automobile by her husband. She tumbled backwards with her husband next to the wheel of the car. He subsequently moved her so that her head was uphill. She was dragged and moved yet again by Todd and by the first responder up onto the pavement. She was given chest compressions. Paddles were used on her. Then she was lifted and put onto a gurney and put into the emergency vehicle. She was taken to the hospital. She was removed from the gurney there, put on another gurney, taken into the hospital where they worked on her, where she was eventually put into the intensive care unit, where she was intubated, where she was punctured, and all kinds of instruments went inside of her. And then you'll hear that after she passed away, her organs were donated. So when the autopsy was done and when Dr. McCubbin examined her, she was not in the state she was immediately after the occurrence. And you will hear Dr. McCubbin tell you that while she thinks that the constellation of injuries that she suffered were inconsistent with a single blow to the head by a pipe, that she cannot explain to you many of the injuries which she saw. Dr. Cook will explain those injuries to you. You will also hear from Dr. Barry Bates. Dr. Barry Bates is a renowned biomechanic. And a biomechanic is someone who is cross-trained in various fields, including engineering and physics, has familiarity with medicine. And these are people who are engaged in the human dynamics of what occurs when accidents occur. And very frequently and most frequently in automobile accidents. These are the people who invented the crash test dummies. And he will explain to you how her injuries are consistent with precisely what Todd Kendhammer said occurred. And then you will hear from Mark Mishalem. And Mark Mishalem is one of the foremost glass experts in the nation. And he will tell you that the fracturing of the glass and the puncturing of the glass is consistent with what Todd Kendhammer said occurred. When it was clear that Barbara was going to pass away, Todd had spent the entire time in the hospital where she was. As much time as he could by her bedside, holding her hand. You will hear about his DNA on her fingernails. You will hear about how DNA can be transferred simply by touch. You will hear about how DNA among married couples who live under the same roof is transferred from one another all of the time. And when the time came, he held her hand And he said, I will take care of your mom. And I love you too. When you've heard everything, it isn't simply that the state will not have proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he killed his spouse. You will know that Todd Kendhammer could never have even had the thought pass through his head. And I will ask you to find him not guilty. Thank you.